The multiplayer Zeldas are arguably the most interesting entries in the entire series. Nobody talks about them, which almost makes them feel forgotten. When they are brought up, there's a general indifference toward them, more often than not with a negative slant because for as many Zelda fans that exist, apparently none of them have friends, but we'll get into that later. They were also released in the most suboptimal spots in the whole series. Four Swords was a tie-in to A Link to the Past, which on the surface might seem like a side mode akin to what the Mario Advance titles did with Mario Bros. But it's actually a full-fledged mainline entry, and the standalone Anniversary Edition released on the DSi proves as much. Four Swords Adventures came out the same year the Minish Cap was released, Twilight Princess was announced, and shortly after the Wind Waker came out, which are all far more beloved and recognizable entries in the series. Triforce Heroes was released in 2015, when Breath of the Wild was supposed to come out. This game was something to tide fans over until the next big game, something that is usually reserved for remakes and remasters. These circumstances are a major leading factor in the overall niche aura that surrounds every fiber of their being. However, interesting doesn't necessarily mean good. The reputation of being three of the games of all time is perhaps earned, or maybe the subset who adore these games as hidden gems are correct, and more people need to give them a shot to see their brilliance. There's only one way to find out though, so let's not waste any more time and dive straight into this multiplayer Zelda retrospective. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't have much to say about Four Swords. It's an interesting experience, a cozy little game, though it is pretty forgettable. It's basically the Bowser's Fury of its time. What initially seems like a fun little side mode is, in reality, a proper fleshed out game. The game is smaller in scope, so it's packed with another game already released just about a decade prior so they can add even more value to the package. One of the games in this dual pack is more single player focused, while the other emphasizes multiplayer. It's even named similarly, A Link to the Past and Four Swords, compared to 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. Four Swords draws heavily from the Minish Cap, sharing its art style and a story tied to Vaati's return. If you've seen my Minish Cap video, you'd know my feelings about Vaati as a villain. Despite this, having a character not directly linked to Ganon as a recurring thread is refreshing. Also, I know this was released 2 years before Minish Cap, but Minish Cap had already been in development since at least 2001, but was put on hold to get this game out. The graphics were most certainly reused for this game, and not the other way around. The soundtrack is one of the weakest in the series. Any theme not directly lifted from prior entries is out of my brain the second it ends. Even then, I'm not too fond of most of these versions of the themes, apart from Labyrinth. That one's neat, even if it isn't my favorite version of the theme. For this video, I played the Anniversary Edition of the game, which is the only way you can experience it as a single player. What surprised me the most about this game was how much I enjoyed the experience, sometimes even more than its successors, though we'll get more into that later. It's a far shorter game than the other two, feeling like a proof of concept for a multiplayer Zelda game compared to them. It's not just the length that causes this feeling though, as a lot of the game doesn't really feel like it puts too much emphasis on the game's multiplayer aspect. The game in general is designed in a way where the single player experience isn't that far off from a multiplayer experience. This makes me wonder why the game was initially locked behind required multiplayer. Maybe they just changed stuff up for the DSi re-release, but outside of adding content, I can't imagine they changed the original content. I'm sure they could have found a way to make it work on the GBA. Still, they were railroaded in their vision towards multiplayer since technically there was already a single player experience alongside its original release. While the level design doesn't take advantage of the multiplayer, some pretty cool enemies take advantage of multiple players. Bulbuls are most effective if you attack with 2 links on each side, since they bounce around and will restore this gelatinous substance that you need to get through to damage it after a few seconds.
I'm sorry, that's the best I can do. That take took so freaking long.
Kikuns require you to pull them apart in both directions after stunning it. Knockuns you need to throw toward the other player since they can only be damaged when in midair. It's a pretty engaging way to approach enemies. Just a quick aside, these enemy names are pretty mid and I don't like them. While these enemies are pretty cool, I find it strange that this is the extent of having multiple players versus just one. Single player isn't that different. You don't even really feel the unique aspects of these monsters since your AI pal will take care of them just fine. But beyond that, I find that the level design doesn't fully utilize the characters. One thing that I'm not the biggest fan of is the random generation. While it's not exactly like the caves from Pikmin 2, it still has the same general problems as that game, without being quite as severe. The levels lack that Zelda oomph that I expect. and while I don't think any of them are bad or anything, they aren't anything special, and I find that I forget about rooms as soon as I leave them. You'd be hard-pressed to call anything here a puzzle. Some areas aren't randomized, at least as far as I could tell. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Realm of Memories is based on areas from A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, and the first game, which is why it's my favorite part of the game. It feels much more free and engaging overall because it uses these handcrafted worlds instead of just slapping an algorithm on everything and hoping for the best. It also ties into the most shocking thing in the game. There aren't any dungeons. It's a weird hybrid of overworld and dungeon, so you can't say the game fully captures either aspect. It's the only Zelda game that doesn't have that distinct experience, and I just find that strange. The roguelite elements certainly alleviate this, though the random generation isn't as good as a lot of those games, and it doesn't go far enough with it to be a satisfactory replacement. Honestly, this is my biggest problem with the random generation. The only reason there aren't any dungeons is because they wouldn't play nice with the random generation, unless you want to consider the individual levels dungeons, but given Realm of Memories, I doubt that their initial intention was to treat the levels as dungeons. The hybrid nature doesn't ruin the game or anything, but it doesn't enrich it in any meaningful way either. To bring something positive up, Vaati is a cool final boss. He's not quite as good as in Minish Cap, but he uses the two links well. That's about it. He's neat. I don't know, I don't have much to say about this one. It's serviceable, but it's basically the game equivalent of going in one ear and out the other. It's an interesting piece of history in the series as the first multiplayer game, but it doesn't offer much else outside of that. To talk about Four Swords Adventures, I must first bring up the game's biggest flaw as it pertains to the entire experience. It's a bit of a two sides of the same coin ordeal, the reliance on multiplayer and how multiplayer works in the game. They may not seem super related, but they do affect each other, and it seeps out into the very design of the game. Starting with my initial complaint, the game isn't designed in a way to be optimal for a single player experience. In fact, it feels like playing alone is actively discouraged. The control scheme doesn't feel that great, at least to me. Lining everyone up to do a specific task, whether by pressing a button and cycling to whatever formation you need, or by using the C-stick, it never feels right, and it adds a jerky start and stop rhythm to the whole game in a way that breaks the pacing, even when I did get used to the controls. Technically speaking, single player is functional, but so much of the experience is bogged down by the ever-present and clear feeling looming over you that you should be playing with friends. This is where my second complaint kicks into high gear, as even back in 2004, when it was initially released, the multiplayer was far too cumbersome and expensive to set up. You need at least 2 GBAs and 2 GBA link cables, and even then, the game is more fun with at least 3 people playing. That's a lot of money to drop on a single game, and nowadays it's even worse, unless you want to play on an emulator, but we all know how Nintendo feels about that. The purpose behind this is baffling, as it's to give everyone their own screen, which I fail to see the value in. The core gameplay loop is based around teamwork, with some chaos thrown in to shake things up. This setup doesn't work with this gameplay in mind. For instance, there's this one moment in the first chapter when players have to find the correct path in a cave, and if someone does it but the others playing haven't, it's a lot harder to help them out because of how arbitrarily segmented everyone is. Not having a split screen on the TV and relying on the Game Boy runs counter to a lot of the level design. It is needlessly complicated to coordinate everything since you can't see what other players are doing half the time. In this sense, single player is better since you'll always know what's happening. Still, you'll have moments where you need to do multiple things at once, which ends up feeling clunky. For instance, there are times when you'll need to take multiple pathways to solve a dungeon. So either way you slice it, the way the game is set up is fundamentally flawed for such an arbitrary reason. If it were an option, I'd say it was pretty cool, but it's not. It's mandated. So if you don't have the cash to spend, you're stuck with an experience that isn't that great. The game also has a weird identity problem, which could be said of Four Swords, but that was at least more understandable than here. It's not like it lacks an identity, but it doesn't stand out. The graphics are a strange mishmash of the Minish Cap and A Link to the Past, with the particles taken from the Wind Waker. It's not bad looking, but it's also strange that they wouldn't go for a more distinct look, as the last 2D game on home console for 20 years. I can't be too harsh on the game's fidelity, as it has to be paired with the GBA without the GBA portion looking significantly worse, even though the whole thing is exceptionally arbitrary. Once again, the music doesn't speak to me. A lot of it is just stuff that came before it. Motifs and whatnot sticking around throughout the series are fine. Still, when it's almost exclusively remixed with next to none of its own identity, especially when those remixes are once again mid, it leads to a soundtrack that almost feels like it was intentionally designed to be forgettable. The story is also too similar to Four Swords. Vaati breaks the seal on a sword, and when Link takes it, he is split into 4 Links, who must then complete several challenges to save Zelda. It is a little deeper, with an evil shadow clone of Link, a la Super Mario Sunshine, but without one of the best characters in the series being behind it, so who cares? Ganon is revealed to be the true villain, lest we have a Zelda game without a Ganon-adjacent villain. It's lame that they couldn't have thought of something more original, even if it would still be shallow. The same thing with Ganon slapped in doesn't make for a better story. The least they could have done is what Yuga did at the end of A Link Between Worlds, fusing with Ganon to gain his power.
Side tangent, I hope that Ganon isn't the final boss in Echoes of Wisdom. We haven't had a non-Ganon related villain since Spirit Tracks. Demise is basically the original Ganondorf, so I don't count him. It would be cool if some other entity was behind the rifts. I'm not holding my breath that it'll happen, but you never know.
The remix angle would have been pretty cool, but it doesn't go far enough to really make the game stand out presentation-wise. If I were to judge Four Swords Adventures solely on its single-player experience, it would be my least favorite Zelda game, no contest. And it goes beyond just being clunkier to play. It's level-based. You get an item at the start and go through the rest of the level using that item to progress. You never keep the item and start with a blank slate at the beginning of every level. The game is far more inspired by Zelda than actual Zelda, which I've never felt with any other entry in the series. I get the idea behind it. It's much easier to curate a multiplayer game around individual levels than a full-on game, since it's easier to know the goal than some nebulous open field. Still, I feel all 3 of these games using the same structure overly limit what the concept of a multiplayer Zelda could offer. Imagining even one of them being made within the framework of a proper Zelda game would have been fantastic. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't Four Swords structured the same way? Isn't that a double standard?
Also, like, Triforce Heroes, I kinda forgot about that one. Just ignore that one for a minute, okay, dude?
The way I see it, a few things make it work more there compared to here. The biggest thing is that it's a much smaller title. You only need 2 people and there are only 6 levels. It was easier to brush this fact aside. Since Adventures is going beyond that, the cracks start to surface. This structure on its own fails to engage me. On top of this, you only ever needed to keep track of 2 characters instead of 4. When going through the game as a single player, I struggled hard to fully invest in the game. Even Zelda 2 wasn't as bad as this. I could only stand one level at a time before becoming bored and detoxing with another of my projects. This was always my impression of the game because I could never play it with anyone else because of how dumb Nintendo was when developing it. I never wanted to hate it or judge it just because I hadn't played it how it was meant to be. Finally, this year, I managed to convince my brothers to play it with me, and it gave me a look at just how different the experience of playing this game is on its own versus with other people. It's effectively the same experience you'd get playing Super Mario 3D World, just on the GameCube. There's even a ranking system that encourages competition. The game feels better to play when you only have to worry about one specific task rather than every task. If you can set it up with friends, it turns into a completely different game, even though it is still segmented in a way I don't entirely appreciate. Playing in a state where I was enjoying myself, I found that there's stuff that I actually like about the levels, like how in the very first one you see this one bridge towards the beginning, and take a long winding path through the rest of the level until you're finally able to cross it. It's a beautiful Zelda-like moment that does season it a bit with what I like about this series. The levels not being randomly generated helps quite a bit too. That doesn't necessarily make it all good, as even in multiplayer, some stages can't be saved. There are some cool levels here, like, again, the very first one that feels like a snippet of a more significant overworld section, plunked down into an isolated chunk. This stealth mission is pretty fun, but some are just tedious, like the village levels that kind of drag the pacing down. There's also a surprising amount of repeated content and mini-bosses that would be fine once or twice, but they go about 2 times more than they should have. The game is generally harder to play for longer sessions than other Zeldas because the core design of the levels isn't quite as engaging outside of a few pockets of that Zelda goodness. The game also doesn't give enough tasks for all 4 players, so if you aren't playing more competitively, there's a lot of standing around for specific players. They also tend to go on a bit too long. The pacing isn't as tight as I would like. It's a game where everyone has to have at least a decent time to have fun. That said, the multiplayer makes the levels way better to get through. One thing that's quite surprising about this game is that the dungeons are pretty solid, with quite a few neat ideas that force you to think about the layout. I can think of a couple of quick examples off the top of my head. In Hyrule Castle, there's this one part towards the beginning where you need to shoot an arrow out of a room to hit a switch on the other side of the door that leads outside. There's this cool part where you push this room you need to cross through to get to another part of the dungeon in the Temple of Darkness, which really should have been used more. The dungeons generally encourage multiple players far better than any other level. Now, what counts as a dungeon can be difficult to determine. Usually it's the last stage, but in the Desert of Doubt and Frozen Hyrule, the designated temple name is the second stage instead of the third. The Desert Temple is just a gauntlet of enemies, while the Temple of Ice feels like a proper dungeon, so we'll go over the latter later. Infiltration of Hyrule Castle is a little trickier to determine, as it has more of a dungeon-esque feel than the other levels, but it also has more of a level feel than any of the other dungeons. It's more akin to a mini dungeon than anything else. It's pretty fun, and it's one of the best parts of the game, hands down. It almost makes me wish there were more stealth levels in the game. Hyrule Castle is a solid introductory dungeon. You have to navigate through the interior to access different sections of the exterior walkway, constantly snaking around, avoiding traps, and engaging in a massive horde of enemies. It's pretty varied and makes good use of multiple players exploring the space to make navigating through it fun. In multiplayer, it's fun to try and find the right path before anyone else, which also applies to the rest of the dungeons. Eastern Temple makes solid use of these blocks, which you have to push to access different hallways. There are special messages only for one player that they get after carrying these moon pearls to moon gates, and they confuse me, especially given that they're helpful and require you to share information anyway. I have no idea why this text couldn't have been put up on the main screen, but whatever. Navigation is fun, but I can't say there are too many interesting moments. I like the idea behind the moon gates being used to traverse to the Dark World, but given how this game is more railroaded than other traditional Zeldas, it doesn't get much time to shine. That's also ignoring that the Dark World is exclusively on the GBA screen, so way to waste a cool idea. Tower of Flames makes a lot of use of these fire bars that you need to traverse around. Other than that, it's highly forgettable, being far too simple to get through with its central gimmick of what if fire was an obstacle not being nearly enough to sustain an entire dungeon. The Temple of Darkness has the red-blue crystal thing that you hit to raise and lower the corresponding platforms, which is used to decent effect here. There are some genuine dumb parts, like areas where you can fall and then you have to painfully trek to a portal to get back to where you need to be, which becomes a real hassle if you get pushed off for whatever reason. Navigation is a big step up from the previous dungeon. There's lots of motivated backtracking. You have to use multiple players to go down 2 different paths at the same time, and there are even a few puzzles that require you to pay attention to the floor so you know to push a wall. It's pretty solid overall. The pyramid is fine, it's got solid navigation, but it doesn't have a strong identity beyond that. Even looking at the footage of the dungeon, I genuinely can't think of any thoughts on it. The Temple of Ice is the same general thing as the Tower of Flames, though ice is a more interesting obstacle. I like these question mark platforms that disable other platforms, which can lead to you being a massive jerk, as well as a critical thinking challenge, where you have to think of which 2 platforms you want active at that time. The Tower of Winds actually has a cool perspective that decently uses the GBA screens. The main screen is a side-scroller, while the GBA screens are all top-down. It really sells the tower aspect, snaking between the 2 screens to solving puzzles in the individual rooms that open the path forward in the central room is a lot more engaging because of this setup. For as much as I whined about it earlier, and for as much as I still don't like it, I have to admit that it does actually enhance the dungeon. That said, it's the only thing that's going for it, and there isn't a ton of that sweet navigational puzzle solving that I crave, and the individual rooms' puzzles aren't anything to write home about. Palace of Winds is the game's final challenge, and it's pretty solid. You've got enemy spam rooms, good navigational puzzle solving, this one really well designed part, obstacles that are fun to traverse around, it's got everything. There isn't a strong gimmick with this one, but as a culmination to the game as a whole, it's good. Body is about the same quality as Four Swords, the first attack is even a carbon copy. It's easily the weakest of the 3 fights, but it's still alright. After that fight, the tower starts to crumble in a sequence inspired by the one in Ocarina of Time. It's not as good or climactic, but I appreciate the effort. Then Ganon rises or whatever, and man, he's huge. The first phase is just avoiding his attacks and waiting for an opening. It's okay, I suppose. The second phase is more of the same, but he has an orange glow now and you have to hit colored orbs back at him, and it's pretty annoying and I don't like it. Oh yeah, there are other bosses too. They're fine. There's a bit too much of a reliance on each player getting their moment of attack, waiting for their color to be shown, which is fine, I guess, but they don't take the best advantage of having multiple people taking the boss on. The others are standard Zelda fare, and after 13 videos, I'm sick of talking about them. These bosses are the epitome of whatever.
Also, I forgot to write about it for Triforce Heroes. I feel the same way there. Cool.
So, is Four Swords Adventures a good game? It's tricky. In a lot of ways, it frustrates me. Its desire to integrate with the GBA gets in the way more often than not, segmenting the players too much to have a smooth cooperative experience and inflating the game's overall cost unless you're willing to risk getting assassinated by the Nintendo ninjas. The single player is a slog to get through and highlights many of the game's flaws. But the multiplayer is so much fun that ignoring the problems is easier, and the dungeons are genuinely good. I'd say that it's almost too much of a mixed bag to lean one way or the other. It's not bad, but depending on how much it takes to get over the issues, your mileage may vary whether it's good. For me, I'd say it's decent, and there are far worse things than being decent. Triforce Heroes is the most mixed I've been on any game in the series. Sure, I've sounded mixed on Four Swords Adventures, but Triforce Heroes is a game where almost every strength has an equal weakness that counterbalances it. I can't ignore that a big reason for my feelings on this game is that for 9 years it was the last original 2D Zelda game, and it isn't nearly as strong as Link Between Worlds. It also doubles down on the design of the previous two games, just in a Link Between Worlds' engine. Given how the series had been shifting to a more open, experimental direction, it's weird that they went with the tried and true formula that had already been used twice before. Getting the presentation out of the way now, it's the best of these three games, hands down. It's an interesting fusion of the Toon Link art style and ALBW's art style. I'm not saying it 3 times this quickly in succession, you can't make me. On the other hand, the soundtrack is by far the most underrated in the series. I love the Celtic vibe the whole thing has. I can't get enough of every track in the game, which all have this distinct sound. Especially the main theme, the woodlands, the treasure room, the sky realm, and the bizarre yet strange charm of Madame Couture's theme, even if the vocals aren't as French as the character. When the whistling and strings hit the melody, it goes strangely hard. Then there's the story. It baffles me that this gets to be canon, but Hyrule Warriors doesn't. Yeah, this is by far the worst story in the whole series. On its own, I think it's fine. Charming even. The Princess of Hytopia, a kingdom obsessed with fashion, is cursed to wear an ugly bodysuit, and it's your job to undo her curse and bring peace back to the kingdom. It's when looking at it in the context of the rest of the series that I start having a problem. I don't care if you hate Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom stories, you can't deny that they are at least tonally consistent with the rest of the series. This is not the case. It's more in line with a spin-off game like Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land. If you had absolutely zero context, it feels more aligned with what you might expect from a Toon Link styled game. What's especially painful is that the other 3 games with this art direction are narratively at the peak of their respective halves of the series. The DS games are the best stories ever told in a 2D Zelda game. Barring Echoes of Wisdom, of course, we'll have to wait on that front. The Wind Waker is my absolute favorite story of any Zelda game. To be fair here, it does feel like Triforce Heroes is going for a more 3D Minish Cap look, which is distinctly different outside of the key art, so a comparison to that game's narrative would be more fair. Even then, the story is a few steps below that one, and I'm not even too fond of that one. It has interesting ideas that don't betray the series' tone, even if the titular cap goes against the lore. No, I'll never let that go. It's not like the story being mid matters much, as the gameplay is largely an improvement over its predecessors. The multiplayer functions like every other game on the system, so that's a big plus. I will say that it's dumb that they don't allow for 2 players, it's all or nothing, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but whatever. Unlike the other games, you can only control one Link at a time, which while in some instances does lead to a bit of a sluggish feel compared to the other 2, having them always following you, for me personally, it just feels a lot better and more natural. The levels are smaller and more condensed, so even when playing in single player, it's not obnoxious and insufferable to play through it. While some moments suck in single player and make me wonder if they ever play tested it with just one person, the gap between the two experiences is far smaller than in Four Swords Adventures. They're also just generally designed better. It overcomes the issue that I had with the structure of the previous game by being more of an appetizer, just a quick bite-sized adventure before the actual meal that was soon to come.
This being Breath of the Wild, cool.
While they don't have a ton to them that makes them stand out in my memory, they're all engaging, and there's some solid use of all three players, so there are no moments of downtime. Overall, it's just so snappy to get through. If we're talking about the individual levels, then it's definitely the best. I will say though that it feels a little too similar to the other two games after playing through all of these games back to back. One of the contributing factors of this similarity comes from the implementation of the outfit system. It's an interesting idea, though the devs don't go that far with it. I'd say that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do much better with them. Those games actively encourage you to get different armor sets, as there are a lot of benefits to each one, depending on the circumstance. Whether it's helping you overcome environmental challenges, allowing you to climb faster, or improving your defense, it's a reasonably well integrated idea. In Triforce Heroes, they're all a little too situational to be anything more than moderately helpful compared to the standard Heroes tunic. Some are useful enough that you might want to use them in specific levels, like the Cozy Parka, which gives you better traction on ice, but there are too many with only marginal benefits, which means you'll likely only look into the ones with something that would be genuinely helpful. You can't equip outfits for anyone other than the main Link, so it's not like you'll even receive the full benefits of the outfit you picked anyway, since you won't always be in it. At least let them be fitted with whatever the initial player is equipped. I also hate how you get the materials needed to buy the outfits. At the end of each level, you're taken to the treasure room, where 2 chests are standard materials and 1 is a super cool material. And far too many of these particular items are needed to get the good stuff. In single player especially, it's not worth engaging with the system since there's only a 1 in 3 chance you'll actually get what you want. Multiplayer isn't much better as you only get to keep what you picked up, which is dumb. In online play, it makes sense, even if I disagree with it, since it means there's a chance the worst player who was trolling the whole time and actively sabotaging progress can get the best item, leaving the other players who didn't suck to be left with the scraps, but I digress. In local co-op though, I can't think of any reason why you shouldn't get to share the bounty. It ultimately makes the whole system too much of a hassle to engage with, which is a shame. Even worse, you'll seldom get an outfit until after you've cleared the area that it's best used for. So unless you're willing to engage with the optional Drablands challenges, there's no real point to them. To be fair, they can be decently fun, giving a nice bump to the challenge. Personally though, it's not substantial enough to be worth engaging with the same level again. And it definitely doesn't fix the problem of outfits, since they're only a nice bonus, assuming you have them. An easy fix would be if it were structured in a way that required an outfit to access a different part of the level. Replayability would be a bit better, and outfits would feel like a more critical part of the game. As it stands though, it's not that great. While we're on the subject of flaws, let's talk about what is by far the game's biggest failing: the dungeons. These are the worst dungeons in the entire series. They barely even count. At best, they are 3 rooms of a dungeon, and while they're fun, they're still just 3 rooms. This is the ultimate culmination of Nintendo's approach to handheld game design, and in this case, I think it fails miserably. Handheld games have to hold up to a long road trip and a quick trip to the doctor that I know you've been routinely getting. This is why games like Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon are more mission-based than their predecessor. Generally, this is fine, but there are times when it can get in the way and drag the game as a whole down. For instance, the moons in Super Mario Odyssey. There are 880 of them, so players can always feel like they've accomplished something no matter the length of the time they play. This results in a lot of filler that ruins the 100% experience of the game. It's a similar thing here, but to a worse degree. We are actively robbed of multiplayer dungeon content, which would have been really cool if Four Swords Adventures is anything to go by. It's even worse since the smaller chunks we experience are great and easily the highlight of the game. It just feels like the whole thing was sabotaged by having to make it a bite-sized multiplayer game. I feel like that, more than anything, is the central well that every flaw draws from. So here's the deal. I forgot to talk about the final boss. The other bosses are fine. I don't have too much to bring up there. And I don't have a good way to transition to it, so here goes. It begins with the lady stealing your items, forcing you to engage with only your sword, because items were so helpful before. The first phase has you needing to throw 2 players over this ring, totem up to her, waiting for her parasol attack, and then slice her. Afterwards, she'll target one player with the other two needing to attack her from behind. It's got decent cooperation, and yes, it does suck in single player. The second phase is the classic from Four Swords Adventures, hitting your colored orb back at her. The third phase sees you carrying and throwing players onto the parasol surrounding her to hit her from above, with the fourth phase being more of the same, just she's higher now. It's nice and frantic, with you needing to remain constantly on the move. Overall, she's easily the best final boss of any of these three games, and so long as you're not playing single player, she's for sure one of the most underrated bosses in the series. In conclusion, Triforce Heroes is ultimately held back by using the same formula as the other two multiplayer games. This is especially disappointing considering it came out at a time when Zelda was redefining itself, breaking traditions, and seeing what new ideas could emerge from that decision. Yes, it's more refined in some ways, but its unique ideas aren't fleshed out enough to add enough meaningful differences to ward off this almost empty feeling compared to the others. While the levels do make for better bite-sized experiences, that shouldn't be the only experience that is tailored for. In this instance, the drawbacks of the level system outweigh whatever ease it would have added to the development, at least in my opinion. The levels are kind of substanceless if you directly compare them with what came before. Maybe that's unfair or judging something on its merits and whatnot. Still, I can't help but think that how the levels were designed with the structure of the previous two games leads to a more satisfying and filling experience than this game, since they're longer with more secrets to uncover and challenges to overcome. But at the same time, this is the most fun game of the trio. It's paced the best, and I gel with the single-player controls far better. Its single-player and multiplayer aspects are better balanced than Four Swords Adventures, though it also isn't as good as Four Swords, but I digress. The music and visuals are significantly better. It has more of an aesthetic identity than the other two. While the levels aren't as long and meaningful as those other two games, they do feel better to get through. And to cap it all off, the pacing feels a lot better. I find myself liking the game more than I dislike it. It might not seem like it given how much whinging I've done, but it's the truth. I don't have as in-depth thoughts on the strengths as I do the weaknesses, but those strengths are exceptional and tip the scale in their favor. Still, I can't help but think of a better game that plays more to its strengths. One that maybe takes a bit more inspiration from A Link Between Worlds, using that as a base to add multiplayer content on top of, instead of using what half-worked a decade prior to the game's base, and making the levels shorter than there. I hate that this is what I think about while playing, but it's difficult when the game has so much potential that it doesn't fully live up to. Maybe this is reasonable, maybe it isn't. Regardless, it leads to the biggest, most exact mixed bag Nintendo has ever published. I want to love these games. There's plenty to enjoy with each of them, but plenty to dislike as well. I can fully understand people who wholeheartedly love them, wholeheartedly hate them, and those who are indifferent to it all. There are so many mixed signals that are hard to ignore when trying to focus on the good aspects. The one I'm least mixed on is Four Swords, but outside of a few roguelite elements, and even then not enough to be considered a roguelite, it exists, and it's hard to muster strong feelings for it in either direction. Four Swords Adventures and Triforce Heroes, despite being more flawed experiences, have a lot more going for them. Their highs are so much higher. If you have a group of friends who are having as much fun as you, they're great. But if not, it can be hard to look past the problems. The terrible dungeon experience of Triforce Heroes, the single-player slog or mild cooperative disconnect that persists throughout Four Swords Adventures. These are baked into the core design philosophy of the games, which ultimately hamper the experience. I don't think multiplayer Zelda should remain a thing of the past. There's a lot of potential here. If it played more like Four Swords with the level design of Triforce Heroes and the dungeon experience of Four Swords Adventures, then there's the possibility that it would be one of the best games in the series. Or heck, maybe even a full open Zelda game with no levels, and it's structured like A Link Between Worlds or A Link to the Past. As it stands now though, I guess there's a reason these three are so polarizing.